So next morning I woke up and it was at 500,000 views and then went up by 500,000 views every hour for several hours until it hit like around 7 million or so just on that first day. Yeah, so I was shocked.
My guest today is Peter Cowan. He's an independent journalist, he's a software engineer, and he's an environmental health consultant. Peter, welcome to the EMF Remedy podcast.
Thanks for having me, Keith. I'm really happy to be here.
But you have gotten a lot of traction in the last 6 months in writing about the 49er practice facilities. I would like to spend some time talking about that. But first, I noticed that you wrote in your very first Substack post something very intriguing. You wrote that we built a civilization out of physics we didn't fully understand when researchers started documenting the harm. It was easier to discredit the science than redesign the infrastructure. The damage is real, measurable, and documented, but it's built into the system, a default state we no longer notice. The institutions that should have caught it were shaped by the same economic forces that built it. You also go in explaining your connection to this work, and maybe we'll just start with that. So you mentioned your first day of life was spent in the NICU. Start there and tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, it was actually my first, I think, 12 days, 10 or 12 days. I have a twin sister, and this is the 70s, and they didn't have all the same technology for, you know, ultrasound and everything. So when my mom was 7 months pregnant, she went to the doctor and he was just listening and he said, I think I hear two heartbeats. And my mom said, that's impossible. A baby can't have two hearts. And he said, no, you're having two babies. So her water broke the next day and we were born 7 to 8 weeks early. And my sister, she had some lung issues and I had a little bit of jaundice. They put us in the NICU in an incubator. So it's heated and there's electric wiring and there's a fan. And my understanding is that they keep the light on 24/7, combination of letting the doctors be able to see everything while they work and be able to see the jaundice. So, and it's one of those things that now we're learning that jaundice is much easier to cure with UV light from the sun. But, it's one of those classic use technology to kind of standardize and make conditions such that we can control them and monitor. But on one hand, and on the other hand, we're actually causing problems with the technology. So it's kind of built into my existence.
And then later on, you had a different relationship with light. You mentioned in one of your articles that after everybody went to bed, as a child, you would turn the lights on.
I
And
did, yeah. I was, it's hard to say what causes anything as a child, but I think just to simplify, my nervous system was overactive, perhaps, and I had trouble falling asleep, and I just noticed that if I stared at the light, it would kind of soothe me, and eventually I would fall asleep and get tired. I think I'd probably get up and turn the light off, but it just started this lifelong relationship of using light to both stimulate and calm, and paradoxically in some ways.
and then you also talk later about the circadian biology and then issues of inverting day and night. So you have had a 20-year or you've had a 20-year career in high tech. Is that correct?
Yeah, about 23 years.
And so in the beginning or near the beginning of that, you were inverting day and night and coding all night and going to bed around dawn. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I had so I grew up in Silicon Valley in Santa Cruz, a little beach town outside of Silicon Valley. I got interested in computers and I met some kids who were on the bulletin boards. So back then we didn't really have the internet. You would put your phone on a modem and you dial in, and some guy and local guy had actually coded his own bulletin board system that would allow multiple users on. So we'd go on there and we'd chat with each other. And I started coding, and we figured out that at the local university that the guards left at 2 a.m. So we would stay up until the guards left, and then we go on to the university and use their computers, which were connected to the Usenet system, as we called it back then. And so you could get into computers all over the world. And so it was kind of just a natural, the way that our access worked. A lot of coders just code all night because it's quiet and they're uninterrupted.
And then, were you working for a wireless hardware producer?
Yep. Ubiquity Networks. They do commercial wireless. They're kind of a competitor to, say, like Cisco. And I was working, ironically, on their mid-level routers, which are used for things like hotels and sports stadiums.
Can you describe the work environment that you were in with regard to wireless exposures?
Yeah, so their main product is called the Unify network system, and it's like hardware switches and access points. And so there's Wi-Fi access points and cameras. And so there was just rooms with like hundreds of these devices. And at some point, I started working on they wanted to make a router that was just all in one, that would, who worked at like a small business, had a couple, coffee shops or something, could just configure it all on their own without any expertise. And so I would have three of those on my desk at any given time, just because it takes a while for the firmware to cycle. So I'd work on one, and then if I need to make another change, I'd go to the other one and just kind of circle around. And then my colleagues would have them on their desk too. And I think the most striking thing, though, was for the stadiums, they have these big, really big access points that are very powerful. Nothing you would ever use in your home. And the guy who worked in the office behind me had it right above his desk, like kind of just slightly above head level. And my desk was the first one beyond his. So I was probably about 10, 12 feet away, maybe a little bit farther, but no longer than 15 feet away. And he wound up getting some sort of leukemia or something. And as far as I know, he still works there, but I haven't been able to get in touch with him. So it was a toxic environment, and it was reflected mostly in just the way people acted in there. There was just kind of like a high tension discomfort.
When you wrote your first article about the 49er facility issue, was that January of this year?
Actually, I published it on January 5th on my Substack. That was my first post, my first article. And then it went on Twitter or X the next morning on January 6th.
Were you surprised at the reaction to it?
Yeah, I am. So I'm part of this group called the Quantum Biology Collective. And there's a couple hundred members there. And I thought, okay, I'm going to post my link to my Substack in there, and they'll be interested in this. And maybe I'll get like 30 subscribers. And so I posted it on X and immediately closed my computer because I don't like interacting with social media. So if I ever post anything, I just close my computer for a day. And then and I actually wound up celebrating Christmas with my daughters that day. Just it was late this year, and the Epiphany on the 6th. So next morning I woke up and it was at 500,000 views, and then went up by 500,000 views every hour for several hours until it hit like around 7 million or so just on that first day. Yeah, so I was shocked. And
Yeah, I have to say I've never heard a post anywhere on the subject of EMF approaching those numbers at all. What do you think was responsible for all of that interest?
I really got to give the credit to the football fans, honestly. They care so much about their team, and the 49ers have not won a Super Bowl since 1994 or something like that. And this is a team it's a storied franchise with something like five Super Bowl wins, and a beloved owner in the 70s who was just this lovable guy who came from Ohio and just built a team for the players, really. And so but then the team gets moved from San Francisco to Santa Clara, and it's clearly just a business move. And the team hasn't won. And since they've gone to Santa Clara, they've just been plagued by injuries, and nobody can explain why. And this story that the substation had something to do with it had kind of been floating around as a kooky idea. And I gave it, I gave people a reason to believe it wasn't kooky, and the timing lined up with really their postseason hopes kind of falling away. Like they weren't out yet, but they lost some players to some soft tissue injuries. And then the week after my post went out, they lost one of their most important players to a non-contact tendon rupture, which if you read my article, that's what it's about, non-contact tendon ruptures. So I think it was just the confluence of the fans loving it and it just kind of being a good, weird story. And the algorithm on X likes those things too. So, and then then on top of that, it became a meme. So the substation is now just a meme. Like beyond NFL, people just post to say substation got him, and it's like a picture of substation and lightning, and so it's just a piece of culture now that was started feeding on itself.
Was the injury rate different with the 49ers and these soft tissue injuries than other teams in the league?
So I believe it is. The problem is they don't actually break down the injuries along that category. They have what they call MSK, musculoskeletal, I think, but that includes things like muscle strains. And so I was just looking at sports these days is all about gambling. So there's all these really amazing statistics sites. And so I was kind of just coming through them, and a writer named Aaron Schatz had done a lot of really good work on the subject already. And so there's definitely some speculation there, but I think the most important thing is that everybody knows it's true. So you can get people trying to debunk it, but the players know it's true, the fans know it's true, the ownership knows it's true. Everybody knows it's true. It just hasn't been documented with like a fine-tooth comb to get every single injury from every player from every year back to 2014. I know some people are working on that, but the data is not there yet. But yeah, the injuries are the soft tissue injuries are very bad.
So it's not really usual that a broad cross section of the culture is willing to look into electromagnetic forces and physiology. So this is really kind of a unique moment in history. And do you find people through their comments or interaction with you that they're wanting to learn more about this?
It really depends on the audience. It's really interesting. I'm going to try to break it up into a couple. So you've got the mainstream sports press is one big chunk, and that one is largely dismissive. And the commenters on those posts tend to agree with the writers, though you'll get somebody in there. And then you've got, interestingly, the sports programs themselves, like the internet, like YouTube shows and Netflix shows, highly receptive, really just excited to hear about this stuff and light in general. Really curious, open-minded people who most of whom hadn't really heard about this stuff, but a lot of who are kind of getting into it, just like maybe it's entered their bubble somehow on Instagram or something. And then I had some really good reception from conservative radio shows, actually. People, just old school conservative broadcasters who remember the power line wars from the 70s and just know everybody who's been through that and paid attention is like, yeah, obviously. And their listeners are highly receptive as well, like really supportive people. And then to the extent that I got covered in the non-sports mainstream media, which I would say has more of a maybe liberal bent, just no interest whatsoever. Not even dismissive, just like whatever. So uh, that's kind of the broad view of my experience of commenters. And then X has been much more receptive than the other platforms. Instagram is kind of 50-50. there's a lot of people who are fans of like the Rams and stuff, who are just like, oh, you just wish your team would won, you know, like that kind of thing. And then there's Reddit, which is they have no, they just think it's complete baloney. So yeah.
So, for people who have never looked into this before, this soft tissue graveyard, as you once put it, or collagen harm, this is not the only physiological factor. So, you mentioned in your writing disruptive mitochondrial function, cellular dehydration, mast cell activation, chronic immune suppression, circadian disruption. I don't expect you to go through any of these mechanisms in detail, but as you think of the potential harm coming from living in synthetic fields instead of natural fields, what are the things that are foremost on your mind?
I love that term, by the way. I've never heard anybody use that before, synthetic fields. It's really evocative, and I think I'm going to start using it. You know, I'm glad you asked that question because I did list 5 mechanisms in my series. The first article got read by about 100,000 people. The third one that had the circadian mechanism got read by 7 or 8,000 people. And in that article, I said that I think the circadian mechanism, i.e., from toxic blue light, the synthetic light field, especially at night, but unbalanced blue light, which means blue light without the complementary red and infrared, I think that is the number one contributor to the soft tissue injuries. And I think of the synthetic EMF fields as more of the straw that broke the camel's back on that one. Not to say they're not equally harmful. I just what I understand about the circadian mechanisms is that it's a timing issue that really sets the stage for your body not to be able to rebuild that collagen. And so with that kind of in place, it just makes everything else more harmful.
I think you mentioned tendons of steel. You correct me if I'm not getting this right. Don't develop on the playing field, but during productive rest afterwards, or
That's
words to that effect,
That's
right?
absolutely right. Yeah, and in fact, they're being damaged on the playing field and in training as part of the process of theoretically making stronger tendons. That's how it works. If, you know, anybody who's ever done bodybuilding, you damage your muscles and then you eat enough protein and you get enough sleep and they repair overnight. We're not talking about muscles here. We're talking about collagen. It's a separate process. But yes, if you, let's say you're a football player and you train and then you go home or you go out and you party and you stay out late and you get back and you play video games until 2 a.m. Not that I'm saying the players are doing that, but let's just, you're not giving your body a chance to release melatonin until very late into the night. And that's really the timing cue to tell all your systems to, when the physiological process needs to start. And the specific process for collagen regeneration is it's an enzyme called lysooxidase, and it needs several hours of dark before it can kick in. So the longer you're pushing that nighttime with the blue light, the less repair you're going to get. Even if you feel like you sleep deeply and wake up rested, it's not connected to how you're feeling as far as rest. It's a different process.
So you mentioned the blue light issue. These screens that we stare at, whether they're on smartphones or computers, there are probably still some people out there who don't understand that technology and how it's blue light rich, which does occur in nature, but only at a certain time of day. So do you want to say a little bit about that? And
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a really solid point. And if you look at the sun as it progresses throughout the day, it changes in two ways, obviously. Everybody knows how it changes in brightness. Starting from early in the dawn, it's just a very faint light. That's really about the power of the solar radiation. But then you have the color temperature of the light changes throughout the day as well. And there's a critical moment right at sunrise when the blue spectrum, which is a higher frequency light spectrum, spikes up. And it's a combination of the color temperature changing and that sun coming over the horizon and the power of those photons increasing so that There's receptors in your eyes called the melanopsin receptors, and they are non-visual light receptors, and they're particularly sensitive to blue light. The It's 480 nanometers is the number. Probably won't mean a lot to many of the listeners or viewers, but it's a key number because that is right about where our LED lights are really focusing the blue. And so when you are disrupting that cycle by getting up early, say, and turning on your LEDs, or on the other side, sun goes down and you turn on your LEDs or you're scrolling your phone or whatever, you're telling your brain, hey, the sun just rose. It's time to get up. It's time to have some energy. And so a lot of people get this, what we call wired but tired. The sun goes down and all of a sudden they're just like, get more energy. And it's because that circadian mechanism is kicking in again. And so you get this kind of second sunrise after the sun goes down. And it's become, I mean, it's just a chronic issue for pretty much the whole population.
So I'm going to take this all the way to your most recent post on Substack, where you're sort of contrasting the circadian clock with the railroad clock,
Mm,
which I thought that was a great post, by the way. And
thank you.
some other people recently have been looking at that issue of time as something that's really changed, maybe below people's perception. Would you like to talk about that trade off and what precipitated moving to railroad time, if you will?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that a lot of people are talking about that. I Sometimes things are just in the air, in the ether, and it's something that I wasn't planning on writing that piece. I had a couple other pieces I was writing, and it just struck me. I felt I did a talk, and I mentioned this idea that technology is a double-edged sword, and what's like one seemingly innocuous technology that we could look at and see what its unintended consequences were, and the clock is a really good example. So without going through the whole story, the clock was invented by the mechanical clock was invented by monks who wanted to make sure they prayed at the same time 7 or 8 times a day. And it was not completely accurate, but it was accurate enough and accurate enough to find use in the commercial domain as well. And so that was in the 13 or 1400s, I believe. Maybe I'm off by a couple of centuries, but by the time the railroads had really become the main driver of the economy in the United States, at least, and it happened in other countries too, but I'm from the US. I know the history here better, so I focused on that. Clocks had become in the 1800s, we were all using them to schedule our lives, but we didn't have time zones. Every little town would have their town square with the clock, and all the public facilities and the merchants, everybody would set their clock to that. And that's not a big deal if you're traveling by foot or by horseback, because in the example I use in my article, if you're going from Boston to Buffalo, it's going to take up to 2 weeks to get there, and you're going to reset your portable clock with you at every little town you go to. You're not going to notice. Uh, the sun, so we everybody knows about sunrise and sunset. Solar noon is when the sun is at the highest point in the sky. And throughout human history, solar noon and solar noon were the same thing. We didn't, there was, I don't even think solar noon was a term. But what happened in the around 1853, I think it was, maybe I got the date wrong. There was a series of railroad collisions that were based on the operators' times being out of sync. And sometimes it was a slow clock, but sometimes it was they just didn't know which time they were on. And it became more than actually I called it a curiosity. Like if it takes 2 weeks to get somewhere, it's barely even a curiosity. But if you're a train and you're moving at high speeds, the town you're in is changing every few minutes. What's your clock going to do? And the telegraph operators were having the same problem. And so it was this kind of confluence of all these technologies that were emerging, and the system that had worked for hundreds of years no longer worked. And so really overnight, the railroad companies got together and said, we need a standard time so that this stops happening. And they defined four time zones, and There was some turmoil about that over the years, but they've really kind of stayed in place since then. And it was a political decision that was done through private industry and eventually ratified by the US government, but it's something that we're all living with. And it has implications that most people have never considered.
And of course, when we talk about, standardizing time, people might say, well, you're Luddite or, you're opposed to technology. But I think that the point that you brought out in that same essay is that it isn't that technology is bad, it's just that it comes with trade-offs.
Yeah, and that's really the fundamental point I was trying to make. I'm not very dogmatic. I don't really want anybody to believe anything. I just want them to give people frameworks to think about things and maybe understand things that they weren't aware of. And so, like, if I was the person that got to choose which technology we got to keep and which ones we didn't, I don't know how much of it I'm getting rid of. I'm probably just gonna make it a more sane, healthy way of using those technologies. I like technology. And I think in this country especially, there's this idea that if something gets invented, it needs to be deployed commercially. And you see it over again. Like I think there's something like 1,000 new chemicals are created every day. I don't know what percentage of them are commercialized, but I do know that the percentage of them that are regulated are pretty small. So it's just this kind of idea that we actually can think about the choices that we're making and the technologies we're deploying, and we have options here. And even if we don't have the political options that we would like, we have options on our personal day-to-day basis, choices that we can make to change how we interact with the technology.
Yeah, it's a great comment there. And so if we now look back at the situation with the 49er, what's the solution? Is there a practical solution that that you see that might be of help?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cheapest and easiest solution that could be done, or maybe it's too late now, we'll get to that, but they could have just moved so there's the big stadium facilities, and then across the street is a massive parking lot. They could really just have changed everything, just swapped, put the facilities on the far end of that parking lot. There's an amusement park called Great America. Put it right next to Great America, and then put the parking facilities where the current practice facilities are. That would get you away from the magnetic fields. There's still obviously issues with dirty electricity and other things, but they could mitigate they could put filters in, they could make it a pretty clean environment, relatively speaking. And it would have probably only cost tens of millions. It's not going to be hundreds of millions. And the team's worth 5 billion. So it's not like a line item issue, but it's a political problem. They're not going to do it.
Yeah, and if they did, they probably wouldn't say why
Well,
they're doing it, right? Because
that's why I said it's too late because they announced that they were spending $9 million upgrading the facilities in this off season. So they kind of took that card out of their, hand.
yeah, so practical solutions. So if the biggest factor is the alternating current magnetic field exposure, then increasing the distance from the substation
Yep.
should drop the exposures predictably.
Yep.
So, and
And
yeah, go ahead.
I would say you don't have to move that far, honestly. I mean, you know as well as me, it's a cube. The cubic square law for the magnetic field, so they rapidly decline, even if it's very high. It could be as little as like a couple hundred feet, and it's just gone.
The fields fall off a lot faster than people might imagine. So I always just mention to people there are three known ways to reduce synthetic field exposure, and that's removing the source where it's in your control. For example, even on a time basis, turning your router off or airplane mode for your cell phone, verifying that it actually turns off all the transmitters. That's always the most effective. And the second is increasing distance. So where something's not under your control, you can't just turn it off. Maybe you could switch bedrooms so that you're further away from the source. and that will have an effect. This example is a playing field. And then the third thing you can do is careful shielding, which really is impractical with regard to magnetic fields. So there are things that can be done. And, with regard to light, there's a lot that we can do as well. We can watch a morning sunrise and be aware of the peaks of blue. What other things can everybody do with regard to respecting the chronobiology, if you will?
I'm glad you asked that because I think that's one of the things we have the most control over, and I think it's the biggest bang for your buck. Everybody has their own individual sensitivities, so you gotta feel your own physiology. But I highly recommend watch the sunrise. If you can't get out to sunrise, try to get out there for a half hour before 10 a.m. And I think there's a critical window. There's a couple critical. So sunrise is a shortcut. It's a rapid spike that really just entrains your circadian clock really quickly. If you can't get it, it just means you need more time and more exposure to that bright light in the morning. There, about an hour after the sunrise, the UV comes out. And so if you can get out for about 45 minutes, up to 45 minutes, try to at least 20 minutes around that time. It's another way to really get that clock in sync. And then on the other end, as soon as it's kind of dusk, the sun's down and it's getting dark out, switch to dim amber lights or put on your blue blockers. And that doesn't mean you can't go out and have fun. Just how many days are people going out and having and like once a week, twice a week? Just try to be consistent on the days when you're at home and it's is it really going to harm you? No, it's very easy actually. And your eyes will get used to the dimmer light and you'll feel calmer. And more importantly, it's going to allow your clock to stay in sync. And it's not just about how well you sleep. I really want to I want to emphasize that. It's about all your physiological processes working, timing when they're supposed to do their magic. And so I think those three things can just be a huge benefit to people.
How can people best get in touch with your work?
I would say go to my Substack. It's peteranthonycowan.substack.com. I'm kind of building a body of work there. And so if you want to come subscribe and support me, I'd really appreciate it.
I appreciate the work that you're doing, and thanks for taking the time for this interview, Peter.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate all the good work you're doing as well.